Montana Territory, 1873. The snow had finally stopped falling, but the weight of it still bowed the pine branches like mourners at a funeral. Through the pristine white blanket cutting across Henderson Valley rode a solitary figure, his breath and that of his dun-colored horse forming twin clouds in the frigid air. Flynn Quincy had seen 26 winters, but the last 3 spent roaming the untamed West had hardened him beyond his years. Not in his face, that remained handsome with clear blue eyes, a strong jaw now sporting 3 days of light stubble, and sandy brown hair that curled slightly at the ends beneath his wide-brimmed hat, but in his heart. "Just you and me against the world, Samson," Flynn patted his horse's neck as they crested the hill overlooking the scattered buildings of Clearwater. "That's how it needs to stay." Flynn had learned the bitter lesson that the frontier demanded solitude. Attachments were dangerous. When you loved someone out here, you only gave fate a target to shoot at. Better to ride alone, take odd jobs, and keep moving before anyone got close enough to matter. His father had died in the war, his mother from fever 2 years later, and his only brother was killed in a dispute over water rights in Wyoming. The pattern was clear to Flynn: love was just loss waiting to happen. Clearwater wasn't much: a general store, saloon, small church, livery, and a dozen other buildings strung along a single muddy street. But after 3 weeks of solitary riding, even this modest collection of civilization would provide welcome respite. Flynn needed supplies, a proper bed for at least one night, and maybe information about ranch work in the area. Winter was no time to be drifting. As he approached the general store, a commotion drew his attention. A freight wagon stood half unloaded, its back wheel broken completely at the axle. A woman in a blue woolen coat struggled to lift a heavy crate while simultaneously trying to calm a frantic child of perhaps 4 or 5 years clinging to her skirts. "Please, Timothy, just sit on the bench for 1 minute while I—" The crate slipped from her grasp, nearly crushing her foot as it thumped into the snow. Without conscious thought, Flynn swung down from Samson and strode toward the scene. "Ma'am," he called, removing his hat, "allow me." When she turned to face him, Flynn felt an unexpected jolt. She was young, no more than 22, with delicate features flushed from exertion and honey-blonde hair escaping from beneath a knitted bonnet. Her eyes, a clear hazel, widened at his approach. "I couldn't possibly impose," she said, though relief flickered across her face. "No imposition." Flynn hefted the crate easily. "Where would you like this?" "Inside the store, please. I have several more to unload before dark." She scooped up the small boy who buried his face against her neck. "I'm Pearl Evans. This is my son, Timothy." Flynn nodded politely, hiding his surprise at her having a child so young. "No husband in sight either. Flynn Quincy, ma'am, happy to help." As he carried the first crate inside, Mr. Hollister, the storekeeper, looked up from his ledger. "Ah, Miss Evans' supplies finally arrived. Thought that wagon might never make it through with all this snow." "Her wheel's broken," Flynn replied. "There's more to bring in." "Poor woman," Hollister sighed. "Lost her husband in a mining accident last spring. Trying to run that little homestead all by herself with just the boy. Stubborn as they come, though, won't take charity." Flynn returned to the wagon where Pearl was attempting to soothe the crying child while simultaneously trying to cover the remaining supplies with a tarp against the threatening clouds. "Ma'am," Flynn said, placing his hat back on his head, "I'd be happy to bring the rest of your goods inside and then help get your wagon over to the blacksmith." Pearl straightened, pushing a strand of hair from her face. "Mr. Quincy, I appreciate the offer, but I can manage." "I've no doubt you can," Flynn replied, already lifting another crate, "but there's more snow coming and your boy looks cold." As if to emphasize his point, little Timothy let out a pitiful sneeze. Pearl's shoulders slumped slightly. "Very well," she conceded, "thank you." For the next hour, Flynn unloaded the wagon, carrying sacks of flour, beans, coffee, and tools into the store while Pearl tallied her purchases with Hollister. When he'd finished, he found her worriedly counting coins from a small purse. "That's the last of it, ma'am," Flynn announced. "I'll help you get this wagon to the blacksmith now." Pearl looked up, her expression strained. "I appreciate your help, Mr. Quincy, but I'm afraid the wagon repairs will have to wait. I hadn't accounted for the price increase on sugar and coffee." Flynn glanced outside, where the sky had darkened ominously. "How far is your homestead?" 5 miles north, she replied, lifting Timothy, who had fallen asleep on a flour sack. We'll manage the walk, we've done it before. 5 miles through deepening snow with a young child and no wagon. The thought made Flynn's chest tighten unexpectedly. That's not safe, ma'am, not with night coming and more snow on the way. We have little choice, Pearl said quietly, dignity in every line of her body. I'll return for the supplies once I've saved enough for repairs. Flynn found himself speaking before he'd fully formed the thought. I have business with the blacksmith anyway. Let me handle the wheel while you get your boy somewhere warm. Consider it payment for guiding me to good ranch work in these parts. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Are you looking for work, Mr. Quincy? Yes, ma'am. Just riding through, but winter's no time to be without shelter. Something in her expression shifted, a calculation happening behind those hazel eyes. I can't pay much, but I do need help with winter preparations at my homestead. Room and board plus what small wages I can manage. It was the last thing Flynn wanted: attachment, responsibility, proximity to a woman whose face already made him feel things he'd sworn to avoid. Yet the child sneezed again in his sleep, and Flynn found himself nodding. Let's get your wagon fixed first, he said, deliberately noncommittal. 2 hours later, with the wagon wheel temporarily repaired and the sky nearly black with impending snowfall, Flynn found himself driving Pearl's wagon northward. She sat beside him on the bench, Timothy bundled against her in quilts, while Samson trotted behind, tethered to the wagon. It's just ahead, Pearl directed as they approached a small valley. In the gathering dusk, Flynn could make out the outline of a modest cabin with a barn and corral beside it. Smoke curled from the chimney. Someone was there. My neighbor, Mrs. Abernathy, watches Timothy when I go to town, Pearl explained, noting his alertness. She's elderly but kind. The old woman was waiting at the door as they pulled up, her wrinkled face registering surprise at Flynn's presence. After brief introductions and collecting the sleepy boy, Mrs. Abernathy departed for her own cabin a quarter-mile away, promising to return tomorrow to help with preserving. Inside, Pearl's cabin was small but meticulously kept. A main room served as kitchen and living area, with 2 doors leading to what Flynn presumed were bedrooms. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, and despite the simplicity, there was a warmth that went beyond the physical heat. You can put your things there, Pearl indicated a small alcove near the hearth. I'll prepare supper while you bring in the supplies. As Flynn worked, he observed Pearl moving efficiently around the small kitchen. There was a grace to her movements despite her obvious exhaustion. She had removed her coat and bonnet, revealing her honey-blonde hair properly for the first time, tied back in a simple knot at the nape of her neck. Her dress was plain but well-kept, faded blue calico that had seen better days but was impeccably clean. How long have you been on your own, ma'am? Flynn asked, bringing in the last of the supplies. Pearl glanced up from the pot she was stirring. Almost 9 months now. Edward, my husband, died in the collapsed mine shaft near Granite Creek. He'd only gone to earn extra money for spring planting. Her voice remained steady, but Flynn caught the slight tremble in her hands. I'm sorry for your loss, he offered, the words feeling inadequate. Thank you. She ladled stew into bowls. We've managed. The homestead is ours free and clear, Edward's one gift to us before he died. If we can last through winter, spring will bring new possibilities. Over the simple but hearty meal, Flynn learned more about Pearl's situation. The 22-year-old had come west with Edward 3 years prior, full of dreams about building a life in the new territory. They'd claimed their 160 acres under the Homestead Act, built the cabin with help from neighbors, and started transforming the wild land into something that might sustain them. Timothy had been born in this very cabin, delivered by Mrs. Abernathy when a spring blizzard prevented the doctor from reaching them. And you? Pearl asked, clearing the dishes. What brings a man like you to Montana territory? Flynn hesitated, unaccustomed to sharing his story. Nothing special. After the war, home didn't feel like home anymore. Thought I'd see what opportunities the West held. Family. None left, he said flatly, closing that line of questioning. Pearl nodded, accepting his reticence. The spare room is Timothy's, but there's space by the fire for your bedroll. We start chores at dawn. That night, as Flynn lay near the dying embers, he listened to the wind howling outside and questioned his decision to stay. He'd broken his own rule, never get involved. Yet as sleep finally claimed him, his last thought was of hazel eyes and the quiet strength in Pearl's slender shoulders. Morning arrived with knee-deep snow and a sky promising more. Flynn rose before dawn and slipped outside to tend to Samson and the two horses in Pearl's stable. He found her there already, struggling with a frozen water pump. "Allow me," he said, taking the handle from her mittened hands. "I've been working this pump for months," she protested, "and I've been breaking ice since sunrise," he countered. "Save your strength for what I can't do." A small smile, the first he'd seen, briefly touched her lips. "And what might that be, Mr. Quincy?" "Cooking for one, I burn water." Her laugh was unexpected and melodious, transforming her face completely. Flynn found himself staring a moment too long before forcefully turning his attention to the stubborn pump. The days fell into a rhythm. Flynn repaired the sagging porch steps, reinforced the barn roof against the weight of accumulating snow, chopped endless cords of firewood, and helped with the livestock, a milk cow, 2 horses, and a small flock of chickens that provided precious eggs. Pearl kept the cabin, cooked meals that grew increasingly flavorful as she incorporated preserved vegetables from her root cellar, and tended to Timothy. In the evenings, she often sewed by lamplight or taught Timothy his letters while Flynn cleaned his rifle or repaired tack. They were like 2 planets in careful orbit, maintaining a deliberate distance while drawn together by the gravity of shared purpose. Flynn told himself he was just earning his keep until he could move on when the weather broke. Pearl never spoke of expectations beyond the work at hand, yet something was changing. Flynn found himself watching Pearl when she wasn't aware, the way she hummed softly while kneading bread, how she always saved the last precious apple for Timothy, the gentle patience with which she answered the boy's endless questions. For her part, Pearl began to relax in Flynn's presence, her formal Mr. Quincy softening to Flynn by the end of the second week. Timothy, initially shy around the tall stranger, had become Flynn's shadow, trailing him around the homestead and peppering him with questions about horses, guns, and the places he'd seen. "He needs a man's influence," Pearl said one evening after putting the boy to bed. She sat at the table mending one of Flynn's shirts, her fingers nimble with the needle. "Edward would be grateful for your kindness to him." Flynn, uncomfortable with the implication, merely nodded and continued cleaning his revolver. December deepened, bringing Christmas preparations. Flynn rode to town for supplies and returned with small gifts hidden in his saddlebags, a wooden horse he'd whittled for Timothy during quiet evenings, and for Pearl, a length of ribbon in deep blue that had caught his eye in the general store. On Christmas Eve, after Timothy was asleep, Pearl brought out a carefully wrapped package. "It isn't much," she said softly, "but I wanted to thank you." Inside was a knitted scarf in deep brown wool. "I unraveled one of Edward's old sweaters," she explained, not meeting his eyes. It seemed a waste to let it sit unused. Flynn ran his fingers over the careful stitches, a strange tightness in his chest. "Thank you," he managed before retrieving his own humble offerings. Timothy's delight Christmas morning was infectious, but it was Pearl's face when she opened the simple ribbon that lodged in Flynn's memory, a mixture of surprise, pleasure, and something more vulnerable that made him look away first. That night, after the dishes were cleared and Timothy was asleep, Pearl sat beside Flynn near the fire, closer than she usually did. "I received a letter from my sister in St. Louis," she said quietly. "She's offered us a place to live. Says Timothy could have proper schooling, and I could find respectable work." Flynn felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. "You're thinking of leaving the homestead?" Pearl stared into the flames. "I've tried to be strong to carry on as Edward would have wanted, but sometimes," her voice caught, "sometimes the weight of it all, the decisions, the work, the worry, it's too much to bear alone." "You've done remarkably," Flynn said, meaning it. "This is good land, come spring. Come spring, I'll still be a woman alone in a territory that has little use for such." Her words held no self-pity, only stark reality. "What future does Timothy have here?" "What future do I have?" Flynn had no answer that didn't cross boundaries he'd set for himself. He excused himself soon after, claiming early morning chores, but sleep eluded him as he contemplated a future where Pearl and Timothy were gone. January brought bitter cold and a new challenge. Timothy developed a frightening cough that rattled in his small chest and brought a flush to his cheeks. Pearl tended him day and night, growing more haggard as his condition worsened. He needs a doctor, Flynn insisted on the third night as the boy's breathing grew more labored. Clearwater's doctor left last month. The next nearest is in Helena, Pearl said, her face drawn with worry. 30 miles in this weather. I'll go, Flynn said, already reaching for his coat. I've ridden in worse. Pearl grabbed his arm. You can't, the pass will be drifted over. No one could make it through. I won't sit here and watch him suffer, Flynn said, more harshly than intended. Pearl's composure finally cracked, and I can't lose you too. She cried, then pressed her hand to her mouth as if trying to recapture the words. The silence between them hummed with unspoken things. Flynn gently removed her hand from his arm. You won't lose me, he said quietly. But I need to try. He rode out before dawn, pushing Samson harder than he liked through treacherous terrain. The journey that should have taken a day stretched to 2 as he forced his way through snowdrifts and navigated icy slopes. When he finally reached Helena, he roused the doctor from his bed with a combination of pleading and the last of his saved money. The return journey with the doctor's sleigh was slightly faster, but Flynn's anxiety grew with each passing hour. What if they were too late? The thought of Timothy's small, still form haunted him, along with the image of Pearl's face crumpled in grief. He realized with startling clarity that somewhere along the way, these two had become his family, the very attachment he'd sworn to avoid. They arrived at the homestead as dusk was falling on the third day. Flynn's heart dropped when he saw no smoke rising from the chimney. He practically fell from Samson in his haste to reach the cabin, bursting through the door to find the main room empty and cold. Pearl, he called, panic edging his voice. The bedroom door opened and there she stood, finger pressed to her lips. He's finally sleeping, she whispered, then saw the doctor behind Flynn. Relief washed over her face, followed quickly by concern as she took in Flynn's exhausted state. You made it, she breathed, moving toward him. Flynn swayed slightly on his feet. How is he? The fever broke this morning. He's weak but breathing easier. The doctor insisted on examining the boy anyway, confirming that the crisis had passed but leaving medicine and strict instructions. When he'd gone to the barn to rest before returning to Helena, Pearl turned to Flynn, who had remained standing despite his obvious exhaustion. You should sit before you fall, she said gently. I thought, Flynn's voice caught, when I saw no smoke. The fire died while I was tending Timothy. I hadn't the heart to leave him even to rekindle it. She moved closer, reaching up to touch his frost-reddened cheek. You rode through a blizzard for us. I had to, he said simply. That night, after Pearl had coaxed him to eat and all but ordered him to rest, Flynn lay awake despite his bone-deep weariness. He'd nearly lost them, or believed he had, and the terror of that moment had stripped away his carefully constructed defenses. He could no longer pretend that Pearl and Timothy were just temporary employers, just people he was helping through winter. He loved them. The realization was both simple and earth-shattering, but love had always meant loss for Flynn. Everyone he'd ever cared for had been taken from him. The thought of losing Pearl and Timothy, of seeing the light go out of those hazel eyes, of never again hearing the boy's laughter, was unbearable. Better to leave when spring came, better for all of them. February brought thaws and freezes in unpredictable cycles. Timothy recovered his strength quickly, as children often do, but the illness had left Pearl drained. Flynn took on more responsibilities, insisting she rest when possible. Their evening conversations grew longer, deeper. Pearl spoke of her childhood in Missouri, of her dreams for Timothy's future. Flynn, to his own surprise, found himself sharing stories of his family, his father's quiet strength, his mother's love of poetry, his brother's reckless laughter. Why have you never settled anywhere? Pearl asked one evening. You have skills any ranch would value. You could have your own land by now. Flynn stared into his coffee cup. Settling means caring, caring means losing. That's a lonely philosophy, Pearl said softly. It's a protective one. Pearl was quiet for a long moment. Edward always said that love was worth the risk of heartbreak, that even knowing how it would end, he'd choose me again. He left you alone, Flynn said, more sharply than intended. He gave me Timothy, she countered, and this land. And memories I treasure, her eyes held Flynn's steadily. Would you have nothing simply because you might lose it? Flynn had no answer that didn't expose too much of his heart. March brought the first genuine signs of spring. Snowdrops pushed through the melting drifts, and the creek behind the property ran high with snowmelt. Flynn began preparing fields for planting, while Pearl started seedlings indoors for her kitchen garden. They worked side by side, their routine comfortable yet charged with unspoken tension. Flynn knew he should leave. The trails would soon be clear, and ranch work would be plentiful as operations geared up for spring roundups. Yet each morning he found another task that needed completing, another reason to stay just one more day. The decision was made for him when Pearl received a letter from her sister. "She's sending money for our tickets to St. Louis," Pearl announced one evening. "She says we must come by June at the latest." Flynn felt as though he'd been kicked in the chest. "You've decided then?" Pearl wouldn't meet his eyes. "It seems the sensible choice. Timothy will have opportunities there that Montana can't offer." "And what about what you want?" Flynn asked, his voice low. "What I want," Pearl shook her head. "A widow with a young son can't afford to be guided by wants, Flynn. I have to think practically. So you'll just abandon everything you and Edward built, the land you love?" Her eyes flashed. "Don't you dare use Edward against me. I've carried this responsibility alone since the day they brought his body home. I've made every decision, solved every problem, faced every fear by myself. If I choose security for my son over sentiment for a piece of land, that's my right." "You haven't been alone these past months," Flynn said quietly. "No," Pearl acknowledged, her anger fading, "but you've made it clear you're just passing through. Spring is here and soon you'll ride on, as is your way. What then, Flynn? Who helps me when the well runs dry or the roof leaks or Timothy falls ill again?" The truth of her words stung. He had given her no reason to believe he would stay, had in fact reinforced at every opportunity that he was temporary. Yet the thought of Pearl and Timothy boarding a train east, disappearing from his life forever, was suddenly intolerable. "What if someone stayed?" he asked, the words feeling torn from him. "What if you didn't have to carry it all alone?" Hope and wariness warred in Pearl's expression. "Are you offering to be my hired hand, Mr. Quincy?" "No," Flynn said, crossing the space between them in 2 strides. "I'm asking if there might be another role for me here." Pearl's breath caught audibly. What role would that be? Partner, husband, father to Timothy. The words terrified him even as they felt inevitable. "I love you, Pearl, both of you." "I didn't mean to, but I do." Tears filled Pearl's eyes. "You've spent months planning your departure." "Because I was afraid," Flynn admitted. "Everyone I've ever loved has been taken from me. I thought if I kept moving, kept my distance, I could avoid that pain again. And now I realize that avoiding love is its own kind of loss." He took her hand cautiously. "I can't promise nothing bad will ever happen. But I can promise you won't face it alone." Pearl studied his face for a long moment. "Edward's been gone over a year," she said softly. "I'll always honor his memory, but—" "But," Flynn prompted gently. "But my heart has made room for you, Flynn Quincy, if you're certain, truly certain, that this is what you want." "It is," he said with absolute conviction. "You, Timothy, this land, all of it." Pearl's smile then was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Then yes," she whispered, rising on tiptoe to press her lips to his. Their wedding in May was a simple affair at Clearwater's small church. Mrs. Abernathy wept happily. Timothy proudly carried the rings on a small cushion Pearl had sewn, and even the usually taciturn Reverend Jenkins seemed moved by the couple's evident devotion. Pearl wore a new dress of soft blue calico with the ribbon Flynn had given her for Christmas woven through her honey blonde hair. That evening, after Timothy was asleep, Flynn and Pearl stood on the porch of what was now their home, watching stars appear in the deepening twilight. "I sent a letter to my sister today," Pearl said, leaning against Flynn's shoulder, "telling her we won't be coming east after all." "No regrets?" Flynn asked, his arm tightening around her waist. Pearl turned in his embrace, her face lifted to his. "None, my home is here with you." As summer bloomed across the valley, the Evans Quincy homestead flourished. Flynn's experience and strength combined with Pearl's determination and knowledge transformed the modest holding into a thriving small ranch. They added a second milk cow, increased the chicken flock, and planted more acreage than Pearl had ever managed alone. Flynn built an addition to the cabin, giving them a proper bedroom and more space for Timothy's growing collection of books and treasures. Timothy, now 5, shadowed Flynn constantly, solemnly learning to ride his own pony, to help with simple chores, to be the man of the house when Flynn rode into Clearwater for supplies. But it was the quiet moments that Flynn treasured most, teaching the boy to fish in the creek, answering his endless questions about the stars, carrying him to bed when he fell asleep by the fire. On a golden afternoon in late September, Flynn returned from mending fences to find Pearl sitting on the porch steps, her face thoughtful. "Everything all right?" he asked, settling beside her. "Better than all right," she said, taking his hand and placing it gently against her still flat stomach. "We'll need to expand that addition sooner than we thought." Joy unlike anything Flynn had ever known washed through him. He gathered Pearl close, his face buried in her hair. "I love you," he whispered. "Thank you for showing me that some burdens are better when shared." Pearl laughed softly against his chest. "You're the one who taught me that, Flynn Quincy. All those months ago when I was carrying too much, and you simply carried it for me until I could stand tall again." As the sun dipped toward the western mountains, casting the valley in amber light, Flynn held his wife and thought about the journey that had brought him here. He had ridden into Clearwater a solitary man, convinced that attachment only led to pain. Now he understood that while love didn't guarantee protection from life's hardships, it provided the strength to weather them. The frontier would always be challenging, often dangerous, sometimes heartbreaking, but facing it together, that made all the difference. In Pearl's arms, Flynn had found not just a wife, but a home. In Timothy's trusting eyes, not just responsibility, but purpose. And in his own heart, not just love, but belonging. The man who had once believed he must remain alone to survive now understood a different truth. It was only through connection that life became worth living. The risk was worth the reward 1,000 times over. As twilight settled over their homestead, Flynn took Pearl's hand and led her inside, toward the warmth of their family, toward the future they would build together.